So, welcome to Fashion Roundtable's second book club. With us today is Rob Hopkins. He's the co founder of Transition Network. Rob holds a PhD from the University of Plymouth and is the author of several books. And starting in lockdown, Rob created the highly successful From What If, What Next podcast, where he time traveled with guests to explore practical, imaginative solutions to the climate and ecological crisis. So, we're here today, hi Rob, to delve
Right.
deeper into your latest book, How to Fall in Love with the Future, a Time Traveler's Guide to Changing the World.
We are. And thank you, Meg, so much for inviting me. It's a delight.
Oh, it's lovely to have you. So, a massive congratulations. I thought this was a beautiful and hopeful book. I think that reading it, for me personally, was such a relief. I think my climate anxiety had hit an absolute sort of peak. And I picked up your book, and it was such a relief that I must admit, reading the introduction moved me to tears. It was really beautiful. So, for those who might be joining today, or potentially those who are going to listen back a little bit later, can you tell us what your book's about?
So the book, I feel like we're living in a time where the future is being cancelled and the future is being colonized and kind of disappearing out of our lives. And that
Yeah,
we face a number of very dangerous kind of movements in the world now who just paint terrifying visions of the future and then position themselves as the strong men to protect us from that. And that if at the same time more progressive voices are also just painting terrifying visions of the future, where is anyone supposed to turn? And the
yeah,
impetus for this book for me came from seeing a photograph of a young woman on a Black Lives Matter protest in the US with a t-shirt that said, "I've been to the future. We won." And it gave me the most enormous goosebumps, and it really kind of shifted how I was thinking about things, and that actually rather than a lot of the language used in the climate movement at the time was very much about collapse and extinction. And when I saw that, it kind of set me off on this different track of being really inspired actually by this incredible bunch of mostly women of color in the US, like Adrienne Marie Brown and Walida Marisha, with roots into kind of Afrofuturism and speculative fiction, who talk about the future in ways that just were so had so much kind of energy to them.
yeah,
And I feel like we have to get so much better at giving people things to run towards rather than just things to run screaming in the opposite direction from. And that we need to get so much better at doing the kind of what isn't expected of us. And so the book is really an exploration of, firstly, what would our activism look like if its primary goal was not just to give people enough information, but was to generate longing, a deep longing for a different future that we could still create if we did everything we possibly could have done. And then the second, slightly more esoteric question, or slightly madder question, is what would our activism look like if we acted as though time travel was possible? Which is a kind of ridiculous question. But actually, there are some incredible activists and artists around the world who play with time in their work that in a way that I just love. That so much of kind of protest culture, we're stuck in the now. When do we want it? Now. It's never like in the future, in the past. And I feel like if we can help people in their imagination to do that kind of mental time travel to the future that turned out the best we possibly could have done in a way that's kind of multi-sensory, then we create something really powerful that also helps us think about the past in different ways and to become more kind of temporally fluid, I guess, is in the work that we do.
yeah. And it's almost sort of instilling this hope into people as well, that something else is out there. There's another manifestation of the future. It isn't just doom, gloom, um, and
Yeah.
all these feelings that we're sort of, experiencing.
Well, I would say also, I kind of feel like anyone who is experiencing gloom and doom and eco anxiety, that is the entirely natural response, right?
Yeah,
We shouldn't pathologize that and say that that you have some sort of problem because actually it's mad. And
yeah,
but for me, but also at the same time, like if I meet people who are just optimistic all the time, I'd be deeply worried about them. But in the same way, when people are pessimistic all the time, we kind of get paralyzed. And pessimism is kind of a luxury that I don't think we have now. We're really, really up against it. And actually, a while ago, I was in France and I gave a talk, and someone told me that in that same room the year before, they'd been to a talk by a woman who was one of the last surviving members of the French Resistance. She was in the French Resistance as a teenager, and someone said, "Was there anything all the people you knew in the French Resistance had in common?" And she said, "Yeah, they were all optimists." And I feel like when the shit hits the fan, you really need some optimists around. And at the
It's
moment,
true.
we don't have very many of them. And actually, what I'm trying to do with the book is to kind of train a wave of optimists, I guess. And also not optimist in a sort of giddy hopium kind of way. There's a
Yeah.
term that I use. There was a film called 2040 a couple of years ago that was an Australian guy made this film about what he wanted his daughter's future to look like. And he called that film an experiment in evidence-based dreaming,
That's
which I
a
love.
yeah.
For me, when I help people to imagine what the future would be like, it's not like hoverboards, rocket ships, and sort of, hemp, I don't know, balloons or something.
Yeah.
It's like actually, it's like because everything that we need to do already exists somewhere. We're not waiting for some amazing invention. We basically, our cities need to have the food systems of Liège, the cycling infrastructure of Rotterdam, the super blocks of Barcelona, the car-free neighborhoods of Freiburg, etc., etc. We just need to do it everywhere all at once.
Yeah. Yeah, I can feel that. And I think the future year that you picked was 2030, but cynics sort of listening to this will say, "Well, that's really soon. It's, 4 years away." And I know that your book covers why you've chosen 2030, as a year in the future, but could you describe your thinking around this?
Well, actually, increasingly, I talk about 2036 now since the book came out
Okay.
because I read a great book by Jane McGonigal where she set out amazing examples of big shifts that happen over 10-year periods, and so I find that really useful. But the reason that I kept talking about 2030 was, or well, kind of wherever, is that basically the Paris Agreement, imperfect as it is, and yes, there are some big countries who are turning their backs on it, but there are many others who are redoubling their efforts on it. The Paris Agreement sets out like a roadmap by how we get from where we are now down to zero by 2050. And that has certain points you have to pass through on the way down, right? So by 2030, we need to have cut our emissions by like 40, 50%. If we don't do that, then we push it out and 2050 is gone and we're like 2070 and then we're like at like 3 degrees or something, and which is absolutely
No,
catastrophic and
yeah,
horrific. Yeah. So for me, it's like I want to, although we know the scale of change that we have to make by 2030 and it's not very far away. So the temptation is to go, oh well, let's say 2035 and just keep pushing it. And like we know when Rishi Sunak was in government, and he just watered down a whole bunch of climate targets. And the Daily Telegraph hailed it as being pragmatic. I hate the word pragmatic. It basically means a cop out, and that
yeah,
you've just flaked out on doing what you're supposed to do. And some people say, "Oh, very pragmatic." No, no, it was an absolute sellout and a complete
yeah,
betrayal of young people's future, is what it was. And so, actually, I keep I keep talking about 2030, 2036 because actually, it's like we need to keep the heat under this stuff. Yes, it might not be far away, and we have wasted a lot of time and we have procrastinated and faffed about, but a target is a target and you have to keep to the target. So for me, the question is how do we take those targets out of dry policy documents that nobody reads and
yeah,
manifestos that nobody reads and bring them to life in terms of what would that 2030 or that 2036 be like, the 2030 that resulted from us doing absolutely everything we possibly could have done, and it was the most extraordinary, exhilarating transition to get there. What would it smell like? What would it
yeah,
feel like? Like if we can't bring it, like Bell Hooks said, "What we cannot imagine cannot come into being," and that
um,
imagine for me is something that imagining is something we rarely do, and we need to be doing an awful lot more of it.
yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think in the opening pages of your book, you take the reader so I wasn't expecting this when I first picked up your book, and sort of in the opening pages of the book, you take your reader straight to 2030, but it isn't the 2030 of despair, because when I started reading, I was a bit worried. But actually, the 2030 resulting from our doing everything collectively that we could have possibly done. And I think that was the part that was so emotional for me, because there are a lot of people that want to be doing, more, and just don't know where to start. So could you take us now and read a section of your book,
Good.
just to give us a feel of what that looks like?
Good, Jam. So, traveling through time was disorientating the first few times I did it, but I feel as though I've got the hang of it now. Just as sailors get their sea legs, I've got my time legs. There's a beautiful phenomenon that happens once that you notice as a time traveler. Once you start to accelerate, once the years really start to fly past, you see a kind of rainbow halo effect through the portholes, a shimmering mirage that causes you to pause in the delicate calibration of your disbelief suspenders and take a moment to just absorb the majesty. It's a bit like the Northern Lights, but in the full spectrum of colors. I'd love to show it to you one day. I'm traveling with my friend and colleague Mr. Kit on one of our expeditions to document the future. As we approach 2030 and begin to decelerate and descend, I get goosebumps, a nervous frisson as we touch down. There are, of course, an infinite number of possible futures that lie ahead of us, quantum threads stretching into the distance. We've explored many of them, including some of the nightmare scenarios, and believe me, you don't want to go there. However, since Mr. Kit and I perfected the design of our cynicism overrider circuits a couple of months back, we've been able to follow the quantum threads to a 2030 that resulted from human beings doing everything we possibly could have done to avert climate disaster. It's no utopia, but it's no dystopia either. It's work in progress, but damn, it's amazing work in progress. After Mr. Kit and I land, I open the hatch and we step out. We've grown quite good at finding discreet places to land so that nobody really notices us arrive and depart. This time we're in a residential street, pretty average in a lot of ways, yet its transformation in recent years has been remarkable. Right away, I noticed the air smells so much cleaner than what we were breathing back in the present. I now know that this is because there are far fewer cars on the roads. The fossil fuels have been phased out, and that efforts have been made to reduce air, water, and ground pollution. The result is an atmosphere that smells like the first evening when the spring starts to turn towards summer, but also something more complex than that. Indeed, it's hard to disentangle the different scents and smells that combine to create the rich aroma of the future. In the way a sommelier might savor a complex wine, I inhale deeply and attempt to identify the different nuances and aromas. I recognize thyme, lavender, and a Caribbean herb known as broadleaf thyme or Spanish oregano. The air smells like growing things. Smells like honey, like deep earth, like damp earth, like forest. It smells of good food cooking. Smells like flowers, intoxicating and delicious. The second thing I notice after we step into 2030 is the bird song. It's louder than what we left behind, but also richer. At first, I'm disoriented by it. There are birds whose serenades I don't even recognize. In 2030, prizes are awarded to urban communities for the diversity and complexity of the bird song, so that residents so that the residents of various neighborhoods engage in good-natured competition to build and erect bird boxes, plant trees, shrubs, and wildflowers, and leave leaf litter on the ground to create habitats for the insects that the birds like to eat. The ban on pesticides and herbicides didn't hurt either. Some neighborhoods have become known for particular species of birds, and at certain times of year, people will travel across the city just to listen. Many residents now use songbirds as their wake-up call, something only possible because of how much louder they are now than before. This place feels more like an aviary with buildings in it than an actual city. Groups of nighttime revelers will sometimes end the evening by heading to a particular neighborhood where the nightingales have returned to bathe in the birds' melodious song. Thanks to the fact that there are significantly fewer cars on the road, the score of our lives is no longer set to the constant hum of the internal combustion engine, but rather to the sounds and symphonies that emerge from nature. Mr. Kit and I are hearing the world around us in a greater subtlety and detail, a richer granularity. I notice more laughter than I did in the world I left behind, and the sounds of rambunctious children from every direction. As we walk around, I see a different look in people's eyes. People hold us in friendly and curious eye contact as they pass. It could be, of course, that they are fascinated by our time travelers' costumes, all in one white suits designed not to protect us, but to protect them from the present day despondency we may have accidentally brought with us. We learned in time travel training that past splaining, saying things like, well, that's never going to work, is forbidden. But there's more to it than that. There's a sense of shared excitement on the streets. It's a feeling of we might just do this that was mostly missing on the streets Mr. Kit and I just left.
I mean, that was the part that made me cry the first time. I prepared myself this time, but I mean, That is absolutely gorgeous. And I think it's important to say that some of the solutions that you talk about in your book, even when you're sort of time traveling, are rooted in actuality. So, for example, the city of Hamburg has sustainable roofs, which are already happening there. Depaving is currently happening across all cities in Europe. Um, and I think what's really interesting is you're giving people sort of real world examples, but almost like a lived experience of the future, aren't you?
Yeah.
And how do you think time travel and rooting ourselves in this sort of lived experience can help us sort of map out a route to inspire change? And what is the neuroscience behind that?
So the neuroscience of it is that the part of our brain where our imagination comes from, the hippocampus, is also where our memory happens.
Yeah,
And in many ways, the process of remembering the past or imagining the future is exactly the same process. The same neural pathways kick in. Because, like, if you'd never been to Italy before, Meg, and I said, Meg, I'm taking you on holiday to Italy next week, and you'd never been, then your
yeah,
brain would send a message down to your memory and say, send up the file with Italy written on it. And everything in there you'd ever heard about Italy, it would then join together into a sort of mental picture and imagining of what Italy would be like. And in the same way, if we just watch GB News all day, it's really hard to imagine a low carbon future because you go to those cupboards of your memory and there's nothing there.
yeah,
And so for me, what this work does is that it helps to create memories of the future. And in the workshops, the trainings that I do that have grown out of this book, I try to give people an experience together with other people where they time travel together, they imagine that future, they capture it, they draw it, they make pictures of it, they discuss it with each other. We do exercises where they make cocktails of smells of what that future smelled like.
yeah,
They're creating memories of the future. Rilke, the poet, once had this beautiful saying. He said, "The future must enter into you a long time before it happens." And so
mhm,
for me, it's like I try to give people also to give people stories, like you said, the book is full of stories of places where this stuff is already happening. William Gibson, the science fiction writer, said the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And so,
yeah,
one of my favorite things when this book came out, there was a guy who got a very early copy through a crowdfunder that we did, and he used it to design his summer holidays. So he went to all the different places in the book, and I
no
met him a
way.
couple of months later. He said, "Rob, I went to 2030 on holiday." I went to the train station in Utrecht and watched 40,000 bicycles cycle past me. I went to the Vauban in Freiburg, biggest car-free neighborhood in Europe. 3,000 people live in a neighborhood without any cars. And, I remember in my own life when I was 25, 26. I was at university, and they put us all on a bus and took us to Denmark for 10 days. And we spent 10 days seeing combined heat and power things, district heating systems, co-housing, solar architecture, amazing cycle paths, offshore wind farms. And we went back to England and we were like, we've got a lot of work to do here,
Yeah,
but we know it's possible because we've seen it. And I
yes.
think that's the thing. Like, if people can see it and touch it and feel it and smell it, then it becomes a new North Star. And all the successful movements of change in history before create new North Stars for people. And I think we've forgotten that bit and how vital that is.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you sort of use sort of all five senses. It's sort of a multi-sensory approach in this sort of narratives that you give. Why is that important, do you think? Is that to literally fill the store cupboards up with the memories so they're far richer, or
I think, for example, one way is you get people to close their eyes, imagine the future, right? And imagine it like a series of pictures. But there's like 3 or 4% of the population who just can't do that. There's a word for it that I can't remember, but there's people who are just incapable of doing that. But human beings can remember 10,000 smells and attach memories and emotion to all of those,
yeah,
to
I read
all of
that.
those.
Yeah. Isn't that
Incredibly
amazing?
evocative. And so, well, what would it be like if we could help? There's a young woman in Berlin called Wasima Labic who does work with Muslim women that she calls Muslim Futures,
Yeah.
helping them, whose daily experiences of kind of racism and social exclusion and feeling quite isolated. And she does this amazing futures work, and she uses this term sensual futuring, where she brings in fabrics for them to touch and smells and tastes and that it's the more that we can make this a multi-sensory thing that works on lots and lots of different levels, I think then the more impactful this is. The thing I realized the other day was often in the climate movement, we look back to the civil rights movement, right? And people like
Yeah,
Roger Hallam talk about, well, what can we learn from the civil rights movement? And should we be more like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, like more like Just Stop Oil or more like the climate majority? And that's a really important conversation. But what that conversation often forgets is that in the civil rights movement at that time, you also had the Black Panthers who were like setting up free school meals programs and running free schools and ambulance services and stuff. And you also had what we now look back and call Afrofuturism, this
yeah,
incredible movement of like science fiction and storytelling and music and filling the future with these bright, bold visions that centers Black culture and experience and life. And I feel like right now we often forget that bit. We just focus on the Malcolm X, Martin Luther King bit. Well, what
yeah.
about that incredible futurism utopian tradition? What does that look like in relation to the challenges that we're facing now?
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think as a mum, one example that stood out to me in particular was the development of the local food system in France, where I think from memory, 100% of the food was organic. I think was it 80% was grown in sort of 6-hectare owned local market gardens.
Yeah.
And to me, that feels almost impossible in Britain, given our increasing reliance on UPFs. And I don't like to use the word impossible. You can tell me off in a minute because I've got a question. But you've seen this in action in France. Can you tell us a little bit sort of about how that felt?
Yeah, well, firstly, yeah, there is a chapter in the book that talks about why we need to stop using the word impossible and replace it with the words not yet. Because actually, all the things that we get told are impossible are the things that we need to do. And the things that we're told possible, like when Rachel Reeves says economic growth is more important than climate. Sorry, what? Um, so I think we have to, and all the things that we know we're told are impossible, I can show you them working somewhere around the world. So the story that you're talking about is a place called Montsartou, which French people always snort at my pronunciation of because it's not an easy word for English people to say. Montsartou. It's about half an hour inland from Nice, and it's a place where they are embarked on the most incredible food transformation of that place, and it could happen here. It could happen anywhere with some kind of enlightened, determined policy making. And there, they have come up with a way where they provide school meals for all the schools in their area, which are, as you say, 100% organic, and 80% of them grown in the area. The municipality used its power of compulsory purchase to buy land that was going to be turned into executive housing,
Yeah,
and instead they turned it into a market garden. And the kids would come out, and they have like a sustainable food center there. So it's also an educational place. Kids learn how to cook. They learn what all the vegetables are. It's all prepared fresh in the schools. The thing that's most fascinating about it for me was that about 6 or 7 years after the municipality made this change within the school community, right? So it was all the impacts were really within the school.
yeah.
They then went out and surveyed the wider town, people nothing to do with the school, just people in the wider community of the town. They found that during that time, people now ate 30% less ultra processed food, 20%, 27% less meat, more local, more seasonal, more organic food. Because when an institution, whether it be the national government or the local municipality, moves with boldness and audacity and purpose, it leads to all kinds of unexpected shifts that you never imagined were gonna happen, and they do it at the same price that whoever Sodexo or one of those companies would have been doing it for, because they produce 50% less food waste, and they eat 40% less meat, and by doing that, they bring the costs
Mm.
down, and they do it for whatever it is, €2.20 a meal, and that model is now starting to spread to lots of other places. Gilles Perrault, who's the guy who is sort of driving it, is on President Macron's like National Food Commission. This is an idea that whose time has come. Really, why would you not do that with what we see happening in the world now and the insecurity and our dependence on long food supply chains? Why would you not do that?
I mean, I completely agree with you, and I think what I just said was feels impossible. Isn't that funny? So ingrained, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think you in your book, you almost say, "Don't say feels impossible, say why sort of not yet." That's the term you use. So it's
yeah,
not impossible, not yet. Can you tell us why that's such a powerful tool? And if I've been trying to do it, but even now I slipped.
Well, we all have such a powerful built-in kind of yes but voice that just trips us up.
Yeah.
And like our fear of appearing a bit silly stops so many brilliant things from happening. There's one of the people I write about quite a lot in the book because he's a great hero of mine was the great Sun Ra, the jazz musician Sun Ra. And the book opens with my favorite quote from Sun Ra. He said, "The future is obvious, but the potential impossible is calling softly and knocking gently."
Yeah,
It's
that's very
just so
profound.
beautiful. And so for me, it's like, w- why would what I try to do in this book and the last book that I wrote that was called From What Is to What If was to move people from that from what is to what if. It's like actually we need to be walking around not just seeing what is and despairing at what is. We need to be looking at the world through the lens of what's possible and
Yeah.
possibilities. You know, we need to look, I think, at this time. We could either be looking at the time we're facing now and saying, "Oh my God, we're seeing oil wars again. We're on the verge of an enormous oil shock like in the 1970s, and it's going to trash everything."
Yeah.
We could also look at it and say, finally, the penny has dropped that you cannot build a secure, resilient, abundant economy on fossil fuels. Finally, okay? Have we got that now? This is like fossil fuels drive everything that is worst in the world. They
Yeah.
drive dictators, they drive wars, they drive all this kind of nonsense. Nobody ever went to war over windmills. It's like, and actually, our dependence on fossil fuels represents the most enormous Achilles heel of everything. And
Yeah.
if and now is the moment to recognize, the Climate Change Committee 2 weeks ago published their report. They said it would cost us £4 billion a year for this country to do everything it needs to reach net zero by 2050. Four
Yeah.
billion a year, right? When there is an oil shock like we had in 2022 when Ukraine was invaded, that cost this country the same amount of money it would take to do all of that transition up to 2050 for one oil shock. And now we're in another one, and they're going to come around more and more in faster and faster circulation. And at the same time, we know that oil and gas companies in 2022 made £700 billion of profits. Like,
No.
Like what? But we haven't got £4 billion to break our dependence on oil and gas companies. Come on, this is really the time when we have to say, okay, oil and gas. The oil age was extraordinary. We had the privilege to live through the oil age and everything that it made possible. But enough already. And we know now oil and gas are by far the cheaper way of doing. No, sorry, I'll say that again. We know now that renewable energy is by far the cheaper way of doing everything. Offshore wind is the cheapest source of energy. Solar is way more cheaper than gas. We have to do this move with great speed and great, like a kind of, if we can mobilize for a war within like 2 or 3 months, why can't we do the same to do a process that means we're not going to have so many wars again because we're moving away from our dependence. Look at
Well,
Spain. Spain is
yeah.
now pretty much, they've been investing hugely in renewable energy. Doesn't really affect them very much because they're kind of off the grid now as a nation. They got 100% of their energy from renewables last week. We could be doing that as well, and it would be profoundly transformative. And the thing is, if we get it right, as I set out in the book, it's not just about energy. That we have to be thinking much more holistically and joined
Yeah.
up. One of my favorite figures that's in the book is that in the Netherlands, if you go to Utrecht, you sit outside the bicycle station, the train station at 8 o'clock in the morning, where they have built this state of the art cycling infrastructure. You can sit outside the train station. I kid you not, and 40,000 bicycles will cycle past you. It's like, oh my, I'm on another. It's like I've gone 20 years forward, and it's incredible
Yeah.
into the future. But the reason they do that is because they have worked out that they spend €500 million every year building the best cycling infrastructure in the world because they know that saves them 19 billion off the national health bill.
Yeah.
So we have to start making policy in a much more joined up way. right? So we like investing in cycling infrastructure. Yeah, it's going to be good. It's a good climate policy. It's also a great mental health policy because we know cycling is great. We also know that air pollution is terrible for people's mental health. We
Yeah.
also know that 40% of young men are homeless in the 6 months before they get sent to prison. So at the moment, we make crime and justice policy over here, we make housing policy over here, and we make transport policy over here. They're all the same. Can we not start to think more kind of joined
Yeah.
up in terms of we need to provide housing for people because that's actually going to save us? It costs like £60,000 or something for someone to be in prison for a year. Could we not front end that onto the first 5 years of kids' lives? Because all the evidence from Sure Start and things shows that when you do that, you save huge amounts later in terms of crime and policing and prison and mental health and all that sort of stuff. So we have to start thinking much more kind of systematically, I think.
Yes. And not what I just said, things are impossible. It's just not yet. That's what we
It's
need to.
just not yeah, because like really, like I mean, we the thing I would say to people is in 1990 when the Millennium Goals were approved by the United Nations, between 1990 and 2014, we cut world hunger in half because it was our priority, right? And we get found the resources that we needed to do it, and we did it, and we could have kept on going, but in the last few years, because of the Trump effect, governments have just kind of turned their back on that process in a way that is morally absolutely indefensible. But we know that we can do those big bold things when we decide to. But when you start to connect up, actually, energy policy links to mental health policy,
Yeah.
and actually all of that, then actually it's like you kill so many birds with one stone, using an unfortunate analogy from a biodiversity perspective, but you know what I mean? It's like,
Do, yeah. We wrote a framework called the creative wellbeing economy, which links up a lot of what you're saying
great.
together, and it is a holistic approach at putting wellbeing back into policy. So yeah, I completely agree with everything you've said, and I think another interesting example that you brought up in your book was what the Welsh government were doing in Banau Brycheiniog National Park in Wales. So I live quite close to that in Wales.
Okay.
Um, and I found that example quite refreshing because there were children involved for a start. And I think from interviewing and doing things with other projects like Pen Pump Project, where I interviewed them, for example, on biodiversity and what they were doing with children, it's really hard for policymakers to look at children in the eye and say, oh, it can't be done. So do you think there's a power there in involving sort of the next generation?
Yeah, so the story for Banai Bracheniog, for people who haven't seen, is that so they did about 3 years ago they did their management plan for the national park, and they wrote, and you can find it online. It's called The Future, and it's beautiful,
It is
full of
beautiful.
like stories and visions and photos from the future and postcards from the future. It's gorgeous. And then I spoke at an event at the Centre for Alternative Technology, and the two women who wrote that report were there. And 3 months later, they wrote to me and said, Rob, we've built a time machine. And I said, what do you mean you built a time machine? They said, well, we got back to the office and we found that we had an inflatable planetarium. I had no idea there were such things as inflatable planetariums, um, that we bought because there were grants, I guess, for inflatable planetariums. And we didn't know what to do with it. And now we've turned it into a time machine. And what they do is they've made this beautiful black and white film with them dressed up as if it was the 1940s, talking about the food system, cut together with archive footage of the food system in the park at the time, and then a film about the present and the challenges that we're facing in the present. And then they invite local school kids to come in and to tell the stories, from make films that are set in the future of what the food system looks like in the future. And then they invite the policymakers to come in and to see all the three films. And they are now passionate advocates that local authorities should be building time machines. And it's very inspiring. They're taking off it in all kinds of different directions now and developing new things, and they're a joy to watch.
Yeah, I need to. I did have a quick skim, but I will delve into that a bit deeper because that does sound fascinating. Um, and it feels to me like there's an element of playfulness required too in terms of time travel. And I think you said, some people do struggle with it, but I think children don't seem to have a problem with it at all. Because when I asked my little girl who's about to turn 9, can you go into the future and tell me what it's like? She had no problem whatsoever in telling me absolutely everything from the future. And to her, it felt very, very far away. And I think one of my favorite quotes from your book was that fascists hate creativity, imagination, daring, playfulness, and people who speak of dreams and build pictures of a future predicated on decency, compassion, courage, and connection. And it's all about sort of building this collective ache for a shared vision. And it's that longing that you spoke of at the start of our chat. So, can you maybe delve into why longing is so important?
I think longing is this. I do a lot of talks in the French speaking world. I'm weirdly kind of better known in the French speaking world than I am in the UK. And when I talk about longing, the interpreters always interpret longing. They take the word desire and put lots of superlatives on the front. So really, 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 really strong desire. But even really, 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 really strong desire is not the same as longing. Longing is that sort of soul ache, you know. And I kind of feel like our activism needs to become, and our activism, our policy making, whatever form our change making work takes, we need to get so much better at not just telling people about the problems and everything that's wrong. We have to talk about giving people the capacity, giving people things to long for, so that any conversation about the future starts with the things that I'm longing for in that future. That the example I like to give is about Alice in Wonderland, the bit in Alice in Wonderland where she's trying to get into the garden, and she's just looking at it through this tiny door because she's too big and she can't get in, but she can see how beautiful it is, and more than anything she wants to be in that garden. I feel like, what would our activism look like if that was the effect we had on people, and with a recognition in that actually those of us often who are activists and policymakers and people are usually rubbish at that. It's not what we do, right? The people in our culture who are brilliant at cultivating longing are artists and poets and rappers and storytellers and
Yeah.
people who write films for Netflix. And we can't do this without those people. So increasingly my work now is about trying to find ways to work with those people. Because the novelist Don DeLillo, one of my favorite quotes, he said, longing on a large scale is what makes history. Longing
Mm.
on a large scale is what makes history. Not writing loads of really depressing books about collapse and extinction on a large scale is what makes history, because it doesn't. It's like actually the cultivation of longing is something we have to get so much better at. And I think a mass movement built on longing is something that I long to see.
Yeah, I mean, I was just about to ask you about that because climate activists and scientists warn about collapse so effectively, don't they? And I think, what role do you think then that creatives, artists, dreamers have here? And as a follow up to this, how can local, regional sort of governments or even organizations better integrate these people into their work?
So I think that creatives have a vital role here, because the way that an artist's mind works. So there's a beautiful thing that I came across recently in the Netherlands, a project called Bosk, created by an artist who got 1,000 mature trees in big pots on wheels. And for a month, he had 4,000 volunteers for a month. And during that time, they took this forest for a walk around the city.
Yeah.
And for 2 days, 3 days, they would go to some windswept plaza that nobody loved and turn it into a forest. And people who walked through that, it's what I call a pop-up tomorrow. People who
Yeah.
walked through that square every day got to walk through it and experience it as a forest with the light coming through the leaves on the trees. And I think, and only an artist would have thought of that. A policymaker wouldn't have thought of that.
Mm.
An activist wouldn't have thought of that. It's like actually they can do those things which allow us to step into this kind of altered mind state where
Yeah.
we see the world in different ways. And I've already forgotten what the second part of your question was.
Just how can governments or local authorities or even
Oh
organizations
yeah.
integrate these people into, because I think that's key, isn't it? We need to integrate these thinkers, creative thinkers into our workforces and
Yeah, there's a report that I talk about in the book, which was written for the UN, which
yeah.
was going through this process of trying to think how might we become a more imaginative organization. And in that document, they talk that they have a series of things they suggest, and one of those is embed artists in organizations, have artists in your team.
Yeah.
And when you have, and also when you're trying to make big decisions or plan new things, have just like, have people in that conversation in the room who wouldn't normally be there. Have a chef there, have an engineer there, have a 14-year-old there, have a landscape gardener there, just so you get all these kind of different perspectives and breaks you out of the kind of groupthink that often kind of dominates that stuff. So I think weaving creative people into teams is one really nice way to start to unlock that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Um, I suppose just going back slightly in terms of sort of climate sort of related anxiety. So this morning I went on a famous social media platform, and within 2 minutes, these are the messages I had. So Britain's food supply is on course to a collapse, climate change, habitat loss, geopolitical instability, waterways being pumped full of raw sewage, AI, biosecurity risks, and finally, to top it all off, the doomsday clock is now set to 85 seconds to midnight. I've been on there for 2 minutes, so you can imagine people are feeling, uh, increasingly anxious and not sort of knowing where to turn, but I think there's also a responsibility here from the media. There's a responsibility to not only inform, but not to completely sort of overwhelm, and instill this sort of terrible fear into people, which I think naturally then competes with your sort of longing and imaginative sort of practices that your book advocates for. So I suppose my question is, what responsibility do you think the media has here? Do you think there's any training, for example, you have a time machine blueprint in your book, which is all about instilling longing for the future. Is that something that, even media sort of platforms could take a leaf out of?
Totally, totally. There's my friend Manda Scott works with this term that Rupert Reed came up with that was throughtopian storytelling.
Yeah,
That we don't need any more dystopian stories. Thank you very much. We are awash with dystopian stories. We don't need really that many utopian stories because they're just too far out. They're like 3, 4, 500 years away and not very helpful. Throughtopian stories are the stories of how we got through and the people in the present day who started something that built momentum, and who did they meet and who came to support them, and how did that create tipping points, and how did it build, and how did it build. And we need those stories desperately. I also think, and we need those across all different kind of media. I also think, everywhere there are stories of great things that are happening and the people that are things that people are doing. And people desperately, desperately need those stories. So we
yeah,
should be having a lot more of those stories in the media. Of course, the media has to report what's happening. It's really, really important that we have a free press that's able to do that. Um, I guess just to, for me, in terms of reframing the points that the people online were making, they may very well be right. They may,
that's the worst
actually,
part. Yeah,
we're in a tough spot right now, and it seems like the people who are at the helm really don't know what to do or have no interest in doing it. But at the same time, we could reframe that as
yeah,
saying we are 3 or 4 years away potentially from a completely different approach to government, and from a huge, like, sort of, what's it called? Uh, the like a Beveridge report in the 1940s of kind of reinvestment and into the things that are actually needed, and using the climate emergency as the sort of backbone to kind of reimagine how society works, to reimagine food resilience, to prioritize nature and the protection of nature. This could either be the end of everything, or it could be the beginning of something extraordinary.
yeah,
And if we reframe it as the beginning of something extraordinary, then I think we start to look at all the things that are happening around the world. Solar energy is by far now the cheapest form of energy, has grown absolutely exponentially over the last few years. We no longer have the excuse that we don't know how to do any of this stuff. The UK already, something like 47% of our energy comes from wind, from renewables. There's huge kind of expansion possible in wind, big projects that are being planned. Like, if we can. It's so easy to just say, well, this is the end of everything.
yeah,
I've been around this stuff for like 20, 30 years.
yeah,
It's like endless. Yeah, you might be right, mate, but actually, and right.
yeah,
And so if we all just buy into that, and then we can all just kind of sit back on our sofa and, feel kind of resigned and like cynical, and nothing ever, cynicism never changed anything ever.
no,
I feel like I'm a father, I have 4 kids. Pessimism is a luxury that I don't have. And
yeah,
also, we must never forget that actually the fact that so many people feel kind of like nothing is changing and feel despondent, and what's the point? It is costing oil and gas disinformation companies, a huge amount of money to create that effect.
Yeah. And I think interestingly, your book, so it mentions a representative survey in 125 countries based on interviews with nearly 13,000 people. So that's quite a large study. And it showed widespread support for climate action. And of the world's population, it said that 69% would be willing to contribute 1% of their income to addressing the climate emergency, and that 89% supported greater political action. You also talked about the fact that individuals around the world systematically underestimated the willingness of their fellow citizens to act. And this sort of perception gap is really very interesting, because I think if you had a media outlet that was more keen to talk about all the things that people were doing, then you've already got this sort of the perception gap closes, and I think
Totally.
that's interesting.
Yeah, and actually, and the thing that you was missing from that was that actually, yeah, 89% of people said that they were really worried about climate change and wanted stronger action to be taken. But when they were asked what percentage of people do you think agree with you, they all said 40%.
Okay.
We have a majority that has been hoodwinked into believing that it's a minority, that it's a
Yeah.
minority fringe position, whereas it's actually by far a kind of a majority position. And again, that's cost a lot of money to create that sense of that being the case. So, and we still see some nowhere like we used to, thank goodness, but we still see sometimes this kind of well, so we should get someone like we'll get a climate skeptic in for balance, this kind of ridiculous nonsense. Um, but actually, a lot of that climate denial stuff has now moved into this thing of, well, we shouldn't move too fast, and we
Yeah.
don't want to, yeah, move too fast and make mistakes. It's like, come on.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the other thing that was interesting is time poverty. So your book says the burden of time poverty falls largely on the shoulders of the poorest, most marginalized in society, people of color, on women and caregivers. And it's hard to plan for the future, never mind fall in love with it when you're just managing day to day. And I think that was very profound. How do you think that we can sort of break this cycle? Is it having a more, or accepting the challenge even, to have a more fluid approach to time?
Yeah, so there's a whole chapter in the book where I talk about how our relationship with time and our understanding of time um, profoundly impacts how we do things as a society. Like in many ways, one of my heroes is a woman called Rashida Phillips in the US who runs an amazing project called Black Quantum Futurism,
Yeah,
and she writes about the links between linear time and colonization. That when a country is being colonized, basically European settlers would arrive in a place that already had extraordinarily sophisticated, complex understandings of time and how time worked, about which we had no curiosity at all. And then we would just put up a tower with a bell on the top that rang every hour, and then restructure everybody's lives around it. It's
yeah,
like, and so then yeah, she talks about that a lot, and I think it's a thing where we need to find different ways of relating to time, different ways of understanding time. There were traditional African understandings of time where time was actually running backwards.
yeah,
There was the incredible sort of indigenous Australian understandings of time where it was this vast sense of deep time over
yeah,
great spans of time. um Yeah, I think it's why I think one of the most important. So Kate Pickett just wrote an amazing book called The Good Society and How We Make It, which pulls together all the kind of empirical science about when a society becomes more equal, all the improvements that you get in society. And
yeah,
one of the things that she talks about in there is about universal basic income and why universal basic income is such an absolutely essential policy.
yeah,
She talks about it more from a kind of social care perspective and an equality perspective. I like to think of a universal basic income from an imagination perspective, because if the problem is now that we are facing existential challenges that demand us to reimagine everything very, very quickly, and we're unable to do it because our imagination muscle, which should be a muscle like this, has become a muscle like this,
yeah,
then actually we need to create the conditions for people's imagination to flourish. And we know that when you have a lot of cortisol and anxiety and trauma and precariousness in your system, it's really, really damaging for the imagination. And so she writes in there about how universal basic income is just a deeply, deeply transformative policy. And I think in any steps towards designing a more imaginative society, that's the way you start.
Yeah, I mean, just touching on this idea of designing a more imaginative society. So I know that part of your podcast, so you created a Ministry of the Imagination manifesto in which you included guest policy asks. And if the government was to come to you tomorrow, Rob, and say, could we have your wish list of some of the, top policies which would better support climate, ecological sort of crisis, or what we were just speaking about more of an even sort of footing for, in terms of social aspects of policies. What would you like to see?
Well, yeah, just so this is something you can find on my website, robhopkins.net. It's like a free PDF. And like you said, I kept all of my guests behind afterwards for a bonus edition for subscribers that was called the Ministry of Imagination. And I asked them to come up with 3 policies that, if implemented tomorrow, would rapidly accelerate our journey towards the future that we had been talking about. So there's 600 policy ideas. And you start reading them and you start out going, really? Like, that's going to happen? I don't think so. And after a few pages, you're like, oh yeah, of course, we could do all. Like,
Yeah,
what,
yeah.
what? It helps to kind of break down that voice you mentioned at the beginning, that voice in your mind that goes, yeah, that's not even
The
possible.
cynical voice. Yeah,
It's like, is it really? Well, I think one of the first things is that we need to get rid of GDP as the primary way that we measure success.
yeah.
It's
Agreed.
stupid. Even the guy who came up with it said that it wasn't actually a very good idea for measuring whether society is actually a better place or not. We need to replace it with indicators of things that actually matter,
Like well-being.
like well-being, like the number of children playing on the streets of our cities, the number of people with good teeth, the number of women able to walk home safely after dark,
Yeah,
the stuff that actually matters, not just whether it's larger than it was the previous year. I think we need much more kind of future oriented policy making that actually is really ambitious about where we want to get to. I think we need a very intentional, very clearly set out phase out of fossil fuels from across the economy over a very clear pipeline. We need no new oil and gas extraction or licenses granted at all. We need to have a very conscious program of reducing meat consumption. Industrially produced meat production
yeah,
needs to be falling, but we need to be, rather than saying you're gonna eat less meat. It's like, actually we need to be subsidizing and promoting healthy plant-based diet and all the health benefits that come from that we know now. We need to, I think, really profoundly reimagine our education system. Our
yeah.
education system is educating kids for the 20th century in a 21st century that is
Agreed.
much more dynamic, and we need schools that feel like art schools, and schools where every day that you go to school feels like you're stepping into 2030. We need to tax the rich and use that money, this narrative that we have got into for the last 20, 30 years. Well, we can't do that because there's no money. Oh, well, we seem to have found an awful lot of money to bail that out and to give to those people and to give in contracts to your mates for that. We need to tax, and we need to be using that to do the things we need. One of my favorite policies in the Ministry of Imagination manifesto is the idea that we need to that all departments responsible for resource extraction should be returned as the Department of Earthly Delights.
Yeah.
There's lots of things in there that are like, we need a department of something or other.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah, so there's a lot there, and also I think we need to really, really prioritize the biodiversity, the return of biodiversity. And one of the beautiful things is, as we see more erratic rainfall patterns and we see more flooding, it turns out we have the perfect solution, which doesn't cost very much at all, which means that we can massively reduce flooding, and we can also a solution that reintroduces biodiversity like nothing else in the northern hemisphere, like in the temperate world, and that's the reintroduction of beavers.
yeah.
And beavers are awesome, and I think we need a national program of beaver reintroduction as well. Well, we're already seeing it. People aren't waiting for permission to do it,
We're
but I
doing
think
it.
but
Yeah,
it would be a lot easier with government support.
agreed. I agree on everything that you've just said. And I think finally, can you just tell us a little bit about your collaborative project with Mr. Kit? It's called Field Recordings from the Future.
Yeah, so I've been working for the last little while with an amazing ambient electronic music artist called Mr. Kit, and I go to visit places that already sound like the future needs to sound like, and I make recordings there, and then he turns them into these beautiful pieces of music. And we did an album called Field Recordings from the Future, which came out last year, which you can find on Bandcamp. And then we made videos for each of those. And last year we did a couple of shows where we did the music and we projected the videos, and they were fantastic. And then this year we've been completely rewriting it as a more theatrical, very immersive show. Um, and we will be doing a tour later in the year, going to Bristol, to London, to Sheffield, to a couple of other places. I do a newsletter every month. The journey that led to this book didn't stop when the book came out, and and so I do a newsletter every month called the Time Travelers Gazette. And if anybody here would like to sign up to that, it's completely free. You just go to my website, robhopkins.net. You put your email address in the email newsletter box, and you'll get that every month. And that's full of stories of what people are doing who were inspired by this work, what I'm doing, and all the news about the upcoming field recordings from the future shows will be shared in there.
And if people want to buy your book, then they can go to Hive Books, and we will obviously link your book at the end of
Beautiful.
the recording.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Or your local independent bookshop.
Yes,
But
exactly.
not the big A.
No, definitely
Avoid,
not.
avoid, avoid.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you, Rob.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for inviting me on, and thanks to everybody who gave some time this afternoon to come and join us.
Yeah, thank you very, very much. And yeah, I'm sure we'll chat soon.
Lovely. I look forward
All
to it.
right. See you later. Bye.